Hey folks, today I'll be continuing my series all about calculation, and today's video is going to be about wisdom. So wisdom when it comes to chess calculation, in my view, really falls along the lines of knowing when is the right time to calculate, and of course what types of moves you should be looking at, what types of things you should be calculating, and how you should be structuring your thought process overall. For today's video, I prepared a couple of examples. Some are from my game, some are not. Just highlighting some useful ideas and some common mistakes when it comes to this kind of stuff of not really understanding when is the right time to calculate, when is it better to stop and think, and when is it better to, let's say, go with your intuition a little bit more. So in this first example here, I think this is a pretty common mistake that a lot of players will make in their games. In this position, it's black to play, and this comes from the game between Tori and Unziker. And so here it's clear that black has a pretty decent position, and with us to move, we have this queen h2 check just kind of hanging in the air, where it seems like there's nothing immediate after king to f2. At least it doesn't immediately seem like black has some winning follow-up there. Nevertheless, in this kind of position, when you have weakened your opponent's king and you have some active potential, of course it makes sense and it's very logical to play for the attack and try to make it work. Now, if you're calculating queen h2 check here, you might notice that after queen h2 check, king f2, black has this possibility to play the move bishop takes g4. Very nice sacrifice. That seems quite interesting. So let's take a look. After queen h2 check, king f2, bishop takes g4. So if white goes h6 g4, black's idea is then to play queen h4 check. The king has to go back to g1, and then after bishop h2 check, this is simply leading to mate. And then after f takes g4, things also look good here after knight to e4 check. White's king is in a lot of danger. If white goes back to e1, then black will simply just pick up the bishop, and we got our piece back, extra pawn, and just totally winning situation. And if white steps forward with king to f3, I don't think the king is immediately getting mated here, but the king is just so weak here that black has a number of ideas to go after the king. We can play rook e6, rook f6, which looks really strong. We can even play a move like f5, followed by playing rook f8 and just going after this king. So white's king is not going to survive here very long. It's clearly just a totally decisive attack for black. And so what a lot of players might do in this type of situation, they see queen h2 check, they see bishop takes g4, looks good. They'll go ahead and just play queen h2 check first, and then after king f2, here they'll kind of pause and think again and really calculate bishop takes g4 and make sure that it's working. And at this point, if you now stop in this position, you might notice, well, after bishop takes g4, white has a third option that we didn't look at yet, and that's this move rook to h1. And it's usually very bad to blunder a move like this, where your opponent gets to counterattack one of your pieces. Now it seems like black's queen has to move away, but if black's queen drops back, like queen d6 here, then, well, white can simply take the bishop, and black doesn't have any immediate ideas and no counterplay. And black would just be down a piece. And so this is a type of blunder I think a lot of players make. Number one, while looking at moves like bishop takes g4, it's very easy to overlook your opponent's resources. This is a huge topic in and of itself, deserves a whole nother video. But yeah, this is one of the most important things when you're in the stage of concrete calculation. When you're looking at these types of piece sacrifices, you of course should not only look at the moves that simply accept the material, but also you want to be thinking about things from your opponent's point of view and thinking about moves that they might want to find and look at, meaning counter moves, counter-attacking moves, their own forcing moves. And in this case, rook h1 is a move that a strong player should not be missing in their calculation. And this could just completely turn the game around from a win into a loss. Now, if you are lucky enough to get to this position where you haven't played bishop takes g4, but you notice, well, after bishop takes g4, rook h1, white is winning, then you can still bail out. You don't have to sacrifice. You can pull the queen back or look for some other move, and that's fortunate. But going back to the original position, as it turns out, if you were able to avoid playing queen h2 check on the board and you're still thinking about it in this position, then you still have a chance to do something else. And in this case, this is what Unziker did. He figured out that he can just start with the move bishop takes g4, where if white takes this bishop, of course it just leads to all of the same lines after queen h2 check. So both hg and f takes g4 are just losing for the same exact reason. And because of this, means white can't really take the bishop. White is just going to be getting mated there. Black gets to snag a free pawn. And of course, the critical thing here is that white doesn't have this rook h1 counter resource. So the real mistake here that a lot of players make is they'll end up playing queen h2 check before fully figuring out how they're going to follow up. Or maybe they do have some idea of this shot with bishop takes g4, but missing this move rook h1 from afar basically means that, well, the whole combination doesn't work. Now, as it turns out, in this position, I think black is actually still doing quite well after a really strong move bishop f5. The point being that we're counterattacking white's queen and also hitting the rook on b1, and so the complications are simply working out in black's favor here. If white goes queen takes f5, black will go queen takes h1. Both queens are hanging, but again, black is the one that is picking up more material. It seems like black is going to be up in exchange after something like bishop takes and g takes f5. So this would certainly be good for black, but if you didn't see bishop f5 from afar, from before you went for this line, and then you stumbled into this position, your opponent plays rook h1, you think you're lost, and all of a sudden you found bishop f5 at the last moment. Of course, this is just an example of like luck in chess, where even though you didn't really calculate the line correctly ahead of time, you ended up a little bit lucky that there was a resource on the way out. Nevertheless, it's much cleaner and much stronger to start with bishop takes g4. And this is why I believe in sharp positions, you really want to take as much time as you can reasonably use in that situation, given the time control and tournament and everything, to really just try to make sure your calculation is as accurate as possible up front. I think it's very rare that you want to, let's say, just play on intuition in these types of attacking situations, because you might throw in queen h2 check and then after king f2 only now realize, oh, this bishop takes g4 is not working, or it's not as clear as I thought before. But of course it would be so much nicer to have figured this out beforehand, and that's what black did in this game and ended up winning very easily after bishop takes g4. This next example comes from one of my games from about 10 years ago, so going way back when. At this point, I was around 2000 rated player or so, and my last move in this game with white was the move bishop to g5, and here black responded with queen to f8. And so my last move I think was quite decent, just developing the bishop with tempo. But now the main question for white in this position was, of course, what to do with this knight on h5. There didn't seem to be any sacrificial ideas using this knight, so my main options that I was considering here were the moves knight to f6 and knight to f4. Both of these moves aim to trade off one of black's knights. Knight on f4 is kind of a nice move positionally because it's trading off the strong knight on d5, but the move knight to f6 might potentially be an even stronger move, because after black is forced to take this knight, white is of course taking back with the pawn and then getting this really strong pawn on f6. So as far as I remember, when I was calculating this position, I really wanted to make the move knight f6 check work here, and I was mainly expecting knight takes f6, e takes f6. And in this position, I was just trying to think, of course this was all in my visualization, I was calculating this, and I was just trying to figure out, well, how exactly am I going to use this f6 pawn? Because upon first glance, it's very hard for me to get my queen to the h6 square in the first place. Like, all of these squares are covered by black's pieces. Of course, my bishop on g5 is still in the way. And even if I am able to get my queen to the h file, well, black's queen is sitting on f8 and covering the mating square. So how am I going to get queen g7 mate here at all? And I couldn't really figure it out. Of course, I didn't want to, spend too much time calculating this if I wasn't going to ultimately go for it. And I eventually just played the move knight to f4. And I think white was slightly better here, but okay, it was a really really messy game from here. But of course, it was much stronger just to play knight f6 check. And this is the type of situation where it's not about being able to just calculate until checkmate here, because maybe there's no forced mate. But the mistake in my thinking here was just not realizing that white's f6 pawn is just strong in and of itself. It's always creating these potential mating threats against black's king, but it's also causing back rank problems for black. And if black's queen is forced to sit on f8 and defend the g7 square, or babysit the square I should say, then of course the queen is going to be passive, and this is another type of advantage that white can use when your enemy pieces are kind of tied down to the defensive squares. This is somewhat of a strategic advantage that might not immediately be so useful, but is clearly in white's favor here. And so I think this position is just strategically, very, very difficult for black. This pawn on f6 is really strong, and white has a ton of ways of improving the position. Things like bringing the knight to e5, and even a little bit slow plan, but slow and deadly, with g3, king g2, rook h1, and then trying to double the rooks on the h-file. And really what my mistake here was just trying to expect too much from the position. I think this is a mistake I see a lot of players making, where they're considering the right choice, but they're not able to really calculate it out till checkmate, and so they kind of assume it doesn't work and they discard the whole line, not realizing that they're still strategically, positionally much better. And just because you're attacking doesn't mean every line you calculate has to lead to checkmate. You can simply stop and evaluate the position and assess that things are going well. Of course, now I feel like I would do much better in this position, but okay, back then I think that was quite an instructive mistake. Later on in this game, actually, I think my opponent makes an instructive mistake of his own, jumping forward a little bit. Now in this position, the situation is completely turned around, and it's actually black who's been able to double his rooks on the h-file and cause a lot of havoc for white's king. And here my opponent plays what looks like a very natural move, queen to b4. And just looking at this move superficially, the queen is attacking 3 different pawns in white's position, which is quite a lot. Material is currently equal, so if black is able to grab a pawn or two, this is going to be a big deal. And of course the queen is activating itself, which is going to be a lot more dangerous for white's king. It's interesting that black here did not decide to give rook h1 check. I believe my opponent just didn't see a good follow-up after king to f2, and was probably thinking somewhere along the lines of he's the one attacking, he doesn't really want to trade rooks on d1, and probably most likely discarded the line based off of that. So instead he goes for this move queen b4, I would imagine not really considering what white is going to do in return, well, simply playing a move that looks good but without really digging deep and making sure that it works. Because again, okay, he's attacking so many pawns in the position, he's starting rook h1 check, and then queen takes f4, queen takes b2, I mean, so many ideas. But after the move queen to d4, it turns out that white is just able to defend everything, and not only that, but create some potential threats of pushing e6 check with a discovered attack. And actually already here, black has totally lost their advantage. Black is now forced to trade queens and go for this endgame that's very close to equal. If rook h1 check, white just goes king f2, and black simply has no good follow-up since the queen on b4 is hanging. If black has to drop back with something like queen e7, like not wanting to trade queens, okay, then white will go king f2, just avoiding the check. The queen on d4 is really strong and centralized, and black has basically lost their initiative. In the game, my opponent ended up trading queens, and we basically had a very equal rook endgame. But going back to this moment, what was correct here for black to do? As it turns out, it was probably best to simply trade a pair of rooks with rook h1 check, king f2, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and for example, queen c5 check. And I think white here is actually just real trouble. I mean, black's queen is now getting in with checks. White doesn't have the stability to really deal with this. I mean, we can play like rook e3, but it's always dangerous to kind of pin your pieces this way, and black can continue with like rook h4, and yeah, just putting pressure on white's position from all sides. This is a very dangerous situation, especially like heavy piece endgames. It's all about king safety, so if someone's king is under attack, when the queen and rook are working together coordinated, it's extremely dangerous, and black here is probably winning at least some material, if not more. And so it kind of feels like a simple solution at the end, but to me it feels like black most likely discarded this just based on maybe some general grounds like not wanting to trade pieces while he's having the initiative. But of course in chess there's often a thing such as competing principles, where one principle might suggest you do one thing, another principle suggests you do something else, but in the end it's really just all about the concrete calculation and figuring out concretely, what's going to cause the most problems for the opponent. So in this case, I feel black just played this move queen to b4, just based on it looking like a good move without really investigating it deeply. I think if he was calculating here, he would see that white's pretty much only response is queen d4. This is the only way for white to defend all three pawns. If black had been looking at this deeper, he probably would have realized that this is just a waste of time and this is not worth going for. From here, whether or not black finds the right line with rook h1 check is of course still up in the air, but black has other ideas as well, and it's just not necessary to lose this tempo with queen to b4. I think this next example will particularly be instructive as well. In this game, black has just played the move knight to h4. This was a strong GM, Victor Bologan, playing as white here. And I really like the way he handles this position. There's already some complications, a lot of knights threatening to trade each other. But yeah, I like how white plays this position. He decides to take on e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, he ends up winning a pawn here. But of course, black's idea was to win it back with knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, and now taking the pawn with queen takes d4. And I imagine white might have already had an idea of how he wanted to play the position leading up to this moment. But of course, this was the key moment where I think white really showed some strong play here. If you guys would like to treat this as an exercise, you can pause the video and think about what you would play here with white. And of course, then we'll talk about it after. So here it seems like the main question for white is what to do about this e5 pawn. And I think the mistake a lot of players would make in this kind of situation is, let's say, trying to go for concrete lines and not really looking at as many options as they have, really limiting the number of options they're looking at. I think the trap that a lot of players fall into, very natural trap, but still something that I think we should try to avoid, is they see that, okay, black is attacking the pawn on e5, white is attacking the pawn on b7, and so they immediately just start calculating, well, bishop takes b7, let's see what happens there. And they might think, okay, I take on b7, black takes on b7, queen takes b7, black takes on e5 at the end. Material ends up equal, we both grabbed one pawn. Whether that position is good for white or not, it's very hard to say. It doesn't seem like it should be. Black's pawns might be split on the queen side there on the ANC files, but white doesn't really have a lot of development. So they might not really find a clear evaluation in these lines, and they might not be sure whether bishop takes b7 is worth going for. So then they default to, well, simply trying to find a way to defend the pawn. But the problem is there are some drawbacks here with almost every move that defends the pawn on e5. So bishop f4 would be the most natural move, but this hangs the pawn on b2, and then you kind of have to justify this pawn sacrifice. If you play a move like queen to f4, this is certainly defending the pawn on e5, but it does feel like a somewhat awkward move strategically because now the queen is blocking the bishop. Sure, we can say that we're trying to develop the bishop to e3, but we'll still have to deal with this b2 pawn. And in general, putting the queen in front of the bishop doesn't seem to be the wisest thing to do in most cases. Now, one move that I think a lot of players might come up with that I think it is a decent move is the move rook to e1, which defends the pawn on e5 tactically. If black plays queen takes e5, of course, bishop h7 check is just going to pick up the queen. But the problem with this move is that it doesn't really solve white's problems if we're thinking about this e5 pawn. I mean, the move that white would really love to play, all things being equal, is bishop f4. Because if we could just play this move and not worry about the b2 pawn, then we're developing our piece to a good square, we're defending that pawn, everything is very natural. If we play the move rook e1, we're kind of defending the pawn for the moment, but we haven't figured out what we're going to do with this bishop. If we play bishop f4 on the next move, again, this b pawn is hanging, and it seems like, well, we might have to spend a tempo playing rook b1 or something just to defend the pawn, and only then get the bishop out. In the meantime, black might play a move like rook to e8 and kind of put more pressure on the e5 pawn. Now black is starting to take on e5 with the rook potentially, and things are actually a little bit uncomfortable here for white. I'm sure white is probably still fine, but you can kind of see what I'm getting at, that we haven't really figured out the issue with this pawn on b2 hanging, pawn on e5 is still hanging. And now that we moved the rook off of the f1 square, this pawn on f2 is also a potential target. So that means that even though we're defending the bishop on e4, queen is now free to move elsewhere. We still have to keep an eye on this f2 pawn. And again, what are we going to do about this b2 pawn? So I do like the move rook e1 in general. I think it's a very useful move. It's definitely much better than taking on b7 and going for these complications that don't really lead anywhere for white. But I think the move that Bologan plays is much stronger. And he goes ahead and just offers to sacrifice the pawn with bishop f4. And I think this is a really instructive moment because during the game, it's always hard to figure out when is it appropriate to sacrifice pawns or not. I think most players default to not giving up material, which I think is quite natural. Like if you can play good moves without giving up material, then in many cases there is no reason to take a risk and sacrifice the material if you're not really sure if you're going to get enough for it. But I think the mistake here that players make is that they're just not willing to look at these pawn sacrifices deep enough. What a lot of players will do, myself included in many cases, is you kind of eyeball it. You see like, okay, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen takes a2, black is grabbing another pawn. We don't have any way of like trapping the queen is just getting out. We might get some lead in development, but so what? Like black is just gonna give back a pawn if they need to, and everything is gonna be fine. And so a lot of players, they take this kind of semi-intuitive approach to sacrifices where they're really just not believing in their position. But hopefully this is a good example to show what a successful pawn sacrifice can look like, and why you might be finding more compensation than you thought previously in many of these cases. So what is white's idea here after queen takes b2? In the game, black ended up playing c6. He, I think, correctly realizes that this pawn is probably too dangerous. And I think Bologan's idea was simply to just start an attack on the king side, maybe with a move like queen to g3, just immediately threatening to take on h6. Black doesn't have a great way to defend against this threat. If they go king h8, for example, white can play queen to h4, and again threatening to take on h6, now with a sacrifice in mind, but really going for a mating attack. And yeah, this just already looks extremely dangerous for black. Maybe black has to go back king g8, I'm not really sure, just to avoid getting checked on h6. But then white could even play like simple move rook d1, getting ready to play rook to d3, bishop takes h6, and so on. And so this kind of leads to a point I made about a previous example where I think a lot of players, even once they consider sacrificing the pawn on b2, they might really try to calculate that out all the way until the end. And if they don't see like a line that leads to direct checkmate or win of the material, they just kind of discard it. They think, oh well, it's not working, or it seems too risky, and then they don't go for it. But in many cases, if you feel like you're getting enough play for the pawn, and you feel like your pieces are going to be active and you're going to be able to generate threats in the short-term future, next 2-3 moves, then in many cases these pawn sacrifices are more than justified. And I think a lot of times it just comes down to just having the confidence of being able to go for this, especially against a stronger player. We all tend to get nervous when we play higher rated players. We don't want to give up material without knowing exactly, that 100% is going to work. But again, once you see a few examples like this, where you see strong players kind of breaking these rules a little bit and giving up pawns where in cases where it doesn't seem like their compensation is so obvious, hopefully just by seeing these examples, you yourself get that confidence and are willing to try and take a little bit more risk in your games. So in the game here, after black played c6, now a lot of players here would perhaps play b3 because they kind of got away with not defending the pawn for one move. So now they can play b3 and everything is good. Pawn on e5 is defended. But of course, we're always trying to play for as much as we can, and in here white just goes rook a d1, just staying on the initiative, playing for the attack, basically inviting black to take on b2, where again, after white plays queen g3, the follow-up idea with bishop takes h6 coming, and then the rook lifting to d6 is just going to be extremely dangerous for black in this position. So black tried to play it safe with queen b4, but it simply wasn't enough. White was already winning here after bishop takes h6. He doesn't even bother with queen g3. I mean, most likely just calculated that after g takes h6 here, queen g3 check, king h8, and queen to f4. Nice detail here, just hitting the h6 pawn, forcing black to come up with the king to g7, and then after rook d3, white is getting this classic rook lift. And I think it's not too hard to judge that when you have three really strong pieces like this, all very well coordinated against basically an empty king, that it's going to be a mating attack. And yeah, black's pieces here are just way too far from the king side to be able to defend, and white was just easily winning. Now, you might say a player as strong as Bologan was simply able to calculate all this. It's quite possible he did, and I think a lot of players, if they're a high level, they can just calculate 3-4 moves ahead. They find the sacrifice ahead of time, and they just figure it out. You know, it's not much of a judgment for them. But for most players who aren't able to calculate so deep, a lot of times you do have to take these decisions and try to evaluate the so-called trend of the position, or basically you're trying to figure out whether your pieces are going to be able to get active quickly, and whether you're going to be able to start posing threats. If it feels like a situation where your opponent's pieces are just developing very rapidly and creating threats of their own, then you would have good reason to be a little bit more skeptical about the sacrifice. But in this case, it was an example where white just had pretty good development and really kicked it up a gear once white was willing to give up a pawn in order to invest in really developing their attack quicker and really increasing their development. So the final example comes from one of my games earlier this year, and I think it illustrates another common mistake that I think has something to do with wisdom in chess. And here it's white to play, and they played the move knight to c3, which I think was an inaccurate move. It would have been better to play a move like king f2, and I'll get into why in just a bit, because after knight to c3, black is able to play the move knight to c5 and take advantage of kind of a hidden tactic in the position. If we just quickly take stock of what's going on here, the material is equal. Black has the bishop pair, which can be considered a small advantage here, but the pawn structure is such that black's bishop pair is not really all that strong just yet. Things are still kind of blocked up, and the position really needs to open up before the bishops make themselves felt. So one move that black has been trying to make work for quite some time is this move knight to c5, which tries to trade pieces but really open up the b file for black's rook in exchange for doubling the pawns on the c file if white ends up trading. And in most cases, I think this kind of opening of the b file, I mean, it'd be pretty controversial, because you do get some pressure along the b file, but on the other hand, your double pawns on the c file are just going to be weak for the rest of the game. So I didn't really want to make this move without some real concrete backing behind it. But after knight c3, black is able to get this chance for free, because after the move knight c5, if white takes on c5 here, and black goes b takes c5, well, now the b3 pawn is hanging, and it turns out that white actually can't defend the pawn. Any move like rook b1 or rook a3 just fall into the same tactic with rook takes b3, and bishop takes c4 check, where black is going to win back the rook. Black has won 2 pawns in the meantime, and is just going to have a completely winning endgame with the extra material, 2 bishops, and so on. So it turns out that in this position, after knight takes c5, b takes c5, white just doesn't have a good way of defending the b3 pawn, and so black is just winning. Instead of knight takes c5, what white should probably do is take on c5 with the bishop, where if we go b takes c5, white can still defend the pawn on b3 with the knight. Black will probably instead take on c5 here with their bishop, once again hoping white takes on c5, doubling the pawns, but leading to this kind of unstoppable tactic, because again, rook takes b3 is going to be the next move, and then followed by bishop takes c4. So yeah, without this trick, I probably wouldn't have played the move knight to c5. And well, once this knight gets here, I think white has to really make a very tough decision, because it's kind of too late to play knight c1 and keep the tension, because again, black has the same shot with knight takes b3, takes, and bishop takes c4. So objectively, what white should do is take on c5 with the bishop, and then after bishop takes c5, not take on c5 a second time, but simply just play this position, maybe some move like knight to e2, where black is clearly better, the two bishops are really strong, but black still has some work to do. It's by no means over, definitely a lot of work to do before the game is won. However, in the game, what my opponent did was he thought for a little bit here, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and ended up just taking on c5 with the knight. And then after b takes c5, I could just kind of tell from his general expression, his body language, that he simply blundered the upcoming shot, rook takes b3. He was expecting to be able to play rook b1 here, or rook a3, and he simply didn't realize that rook takes b3 was coming. So we might think of this mistake as a kind of tactical error. He just didn't anticipate this tactic in time, and all of a sudden it was too late. But for me, it was really just a question of wisdom and practicality, because what white should have done as soon as the knight went to c5, if we just flip the perspective a little bit, is he really should have asked the question, why is my opponent allowing me to double his pawns like that? So of course, me in this case, I'm an international master, so why is a strong player just allowing me to double his pawns? I think it's really important to ask this question because the basic assumption is that your opponent is not just going to give stuff away from free. They're not going to hang something without a proper cause. They're not going to just double their pawns for no reason. And so unless the opponent has just totally blundered, then they probably have some kind of reasoning for what they're doing. And so as a player playing against someone like that, you should of course be very cautious and be asking a lot of questions. Well, what is their opponent's idea? So yeah, here I think my opponent just simply didn't really falsify his thinking. He just saw okay, well, knight takes c5, I get to double black's pawns. It looks like he gets to attack the b3 pawn, but whatever, I'll just defend it. And I think this kind of lack of, let's say, rigor is what causes white to blunder here, because of course he's a strong player. If he had just investigated a little bit deeper, he would have spotted this tactic and he would have avoided the line. He could play bishop takes c5, for example, and then after bishop takes c5, knight e2, the game certainly continues. Now going back one more moment, of course, this is why the move knight to c3 is a mistake. It kind of allows these tactics from black's point of view with the move knight to c5. Instead, I think white could have made other moves. I think king f2 is kind of one of the simpler moves here. Just getting the king off of the light squares. Now white will never have to worry about these tactics again. And then white can play knight c3 next move and just keep the game going. And the endgame would be pretty balanced. So here white's main mistake was not so much blundering the tactic. That's going to happen. You're going to be blundering tactics from time to time, but really just not asking that deep question. My opponent is allowing double pawns. What are they doing? Why are they allowing this? Really thinking about things from the opponent's perspective. I think if I can just give you guys one major takeaway from this video, always try to think about what is the opponent going to do, what resources they might have in the upcoming future, and what their idea is with the move that they just played. If you can really get into the habit of asking these questions, you can avoid making a lot of mistakes, really end up tricking and outplaying a lot of people. Alright guys, hopefully you found this video instructive. If you did, please give it a like and make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.